The night was still, with only the hum of streetlights and the occasional sound of a passing car. Officer James Callahan's patrol car rolled slowly down the darkened street, the sound of his tires barely audible on the asphalt. He'd been on duty for hours, feeling the weight of his badge growing heavier with each passing minute. It had been a long shift, and he was eager to get home, but duty called, and the quiet night offered him little rest. As he turned a corner, a figure caught his eye. A black woman, walking alone along the sidewalk. Her pace was quick, purposeful. There was something about her demeanor that struck him as unusual. He slowed the car, instinctively feeling his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. His partner, Officer Susan Rhodes, glanced over at him. "What's going on, Callahan?" "I don't know," he muttered, his gaze still locked on the woman. "Something about her doesn't sit right." They'd both seen people walking late at night, but this woman's presence, alone and unaccompanied, sent up a red flag. Callahan pulled the car over to the side of the road and switched on the flashing lights. He couldn't shake the sense of unease. The city streets were empty at this hour, and the only two people on the block were him and her. "Let's see what we've got here," Rhodes said, opening the door and stepping out. Callahan followed her. The woman turned as they approached, her expression unflinching, but there was a calmness about her, a quiet confidence that immediately unsettled Callahan. He noted her well-tailored suit and polished shoes, the sharpness of her features, and the way she carried herself, unaffected by the presence of the police. She stood her ground without a hint of fear. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Callahan opened his mouth to respond, but a slight tremor of uncertainty ran through him. He wasn't sure why, but something about her made him hesitate. "We're just making sure everything's okay." "Late hour, walking alone. Got any ID?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, no fear, no hesitation, and her lips parted in a faint but deliberate smile. "I'm not sure I need to show ID to you, officer," she said, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She took a deep breath, almost as if steeling herself for what was to come. "But if you'd like, I'll tell you who I am." Rhodes, sensing the tension, crossed her arms. "Who are you, then?" With a sigh, the woman reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet and opening it to reveal a sleek ID card. "I am Senator Rachel Carter," she said, her voice even, but there was an edge to it now. "I represent this district." The silence between them stretched, the reality of the situation sinking in. Callahan's heart skipped a beat. The woman he had assumed was some random passerby, someone he could easily confront, was now revealed to be a U.S. Senator, one of the highest-ranking public officials in the country. Callahan's mouth went dry as he glanced at Rhodes, who stood frozen beside him, the same realization dawning on her. Neither of them had expected this. "Senator Carter." Callahan finally managed to stammer, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," she replied, her gaze sharp as she watched them both, the realization of the officer's error written across their faces. "Now, might I ask why I was stopped?" Callahan swallowed hard, but he couldn't find the words. He had no good reason for why he had stopped her, no justification for this interaction. Everything about it felt wrong, her poise, her calmness, the way she handled the situation with grace. It made him feel small. He was cut off as a soft laugh escaped Rhodes. She looked at him with disbelief before turning her attention back to the senator. Rhodes started again, but this time, it was a question, "Are you serious? We're stopping a U.S. Senator for, what, exactly?" Callahan tried to keep his composure, but the embarrassment was growing. "Ma'am, we were just trying to what?" The senator's voice had shifted, colder now, an undertone of frustration creeping into her words. "Make assumptions based on my appearance? What were you expecting when you pulled me over?" Rhodes glanced at Callahan, now fully aware of how badly they had misjudged the situation. She took a step back, as if distancing herself from the mess. "Senator," Rhodes said, her voice shaking, we apologize. This was a mistake. We should not have stopped you." "I think we both know it wasn't just a mistake, officer," Carter replied coolly. "This was more than that. You didn't stop me because of anything I did. You stopped me because of who I am. Or rather, who you assumed I wasn't." Callahan's face burned with humiliation. It's not about what you were thinking, Callahan," Senator Carter cut him off. "It's about what you failed to think, what you failed to see in me. You didn't see a U.S. senator, you saw a black woman on the street at night. And that's what made you stop me." The words hit harder than anything Callahan could have imagined. The weight of systemic bias hung thick in the air between them, the truth of his actions laid bare. Senator Carter looked at both officers, her expression unyielding. "You know, the same thing happens to people like me all the time. And it's not just about traffic stops, it's about how we're treated, how we're assumed to be less, simply because of the color of our skin. And tonight, I'm the one who's lucky enough to get away without a second thought, without someone else taking this too far." The quiet sting of guilt dug deep into Callahan's chest. He had failed to see her. Not just as a person, but as someone whose power, whose identity, was beyond his narrow judgment. "I'm sorry," Callahan muttered, the words feeling small in the grand scheme of things. He realized, for the first time, how much work was needed to erase the ingrained prejudices that so easily shaped his actions. Senator Carter nodded once, her eyes fixed on him with a mix of disappointment and quiet resolve. "I'll let you go this time," she said, her tone no less firm. "But don't think for a second that this isn't a lesson. I hope it's one you'll remember." And with that, she turned and walked away, her stride steady, her head held high. The officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of their actions hanging heavily between them. There was no way to undo what had just happened, but there was something that Callahan now knew he couldn't ignore. The truth of his own biases, and the painful realization that they were far from the only ones who needed to change. As the patrol car started up again, Callahan glanced at his partner, his voice low and thoughtful. "We've got a lot to work on." Rhodes nodded, her gaze distant. "Yeah. We sure do." The streetlights flickered as they drove away, and for the first time that night, the quiet felt a little heavier. As the patrol car made its way down the empty street, the tension between the two officers was palpable. Callahan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He could still feel the weight of Senator Carter's words, echoing in his mind with an intensity that made his stomach churn. He hadn't just stopped a woman walking alone, he had stopped someone whose very presence threatened to challenge everything he had assumed about power, race, and authority. "So, what now?" Rhodes asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Callahan didn't respond immediately, his thoughts swirling. He had been a cop for 10 years, had seen countless cases of prejudice, but never had he experienced anything like this. His own biases, deeply embedded within him, had been laid bare in a single moment, and he didn't know how to reconcile them. "I don't know," Callahan muttered, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "I thought I was doing my job, making sure everything was okay, but—" "But you weren't," Rhodes interrupted, her voice tinged with frustration. "You were doing exactly what she said, you saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong. That's the reality of it. That's what we do every single day, whether we mean to or not." Callahan winced at her bluntness, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had always prided himself on being fair, on doing things by the book. But now, faced with his own failings, he realized how deep-rooted the problem was. It wasn't just about a single incident, it was about the system he had been part of for years. "I didn't mean to," Callahan said softly, almost to himself. "I never meant to, I know," Rhodes replied, her voice softening. "But intent doesn't change the outcome, does it?" He shook his head. It was a lesson that had hit him harder than he ever expected. A lesson that would follow him long after this night. The car's headlights cut through the dark streets as they drove in silence. There was nothing to say, no way to take back what had already happened. But as they neared the precinct, Callahan knew one thing for sure: he could never go back to thinking the way he had before. The truth had hit him square in the face, and now he had to decide what to do with it. When they reached the station, neither of them spoke as they parked the car and stepped out. The weight of the night's events hung over them both like a heavy fog. They were just two officers, trying to make sense of a system that had long since lost its sense of fairness. But they couldn't ignore the reality of what they had done, what they had failed to see. As Callahan walked through the doors of the precinct, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. They had no idea what had transpired, but there was a sense of familiarity in the way they looked at him. He knew they wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't challenge him. They would just let the incident fade into the background, another case of routine policing. But for Callahan, it wouldn't fade. Not this time. He sat at his desk, his hands still trembling slightly as he turned over the events in his mind. He needed to process it, needed to figure out what it meant for him, for his career, and for the way he would move forward. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from Rhodes. "I know this isn't easy. But we have to start somewhere. Maybe it's time to look at the bigger picture." Callahan stared at the message for a moment, his mind racing. Rhodes was right. It was time to look at the bigger picture, not just his own actions, but the system that allowed them to happen in the first place. He thought back to Senator Carter, the way she had looked at him with such quiet strength, unwavering in her belief that the truth mattered. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to admit the mistake. Change had to start somewhere, and that somewhere had to be with him. Callahan made a decision that night. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to pretend that everything was okay, that it was just one mistake among many. He would start looking at the world differently, he would challenge his own assumptions, confront the biases he had ignored for so long. And maybe, just maybe, he could help make the system better. The next morning, Callahan walked into work with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer going to be the officer who made assumptions based on appearances, who let the world continue as it was without questioning it. He would learn, he would grow, and most importantly, he would fight for the kind of change that would prevent something like this from ever happening again. And as for Senator Carter, he wouldn't forget her. He would carry the weight of her words with him, letting them guide him toward a future where his actions matched his integrity. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. Because sometimes, the hardest truths were the ones that changed everything. And Callahan knew now that the truth had been laid bare before him. It was up to him to make sure it wasn't just a momentary realization, it had to be the beginning of something new. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet but steady transformation for Callahan. At first, it felt like he was walking through unfamiliar territory, unsure of how to begin the process of change. His colleagues noticed a shift in his demeanor, he was quieter, more reflective. The easy banter that had once defined his interactions with them had given way to moments of deep thought, often alone at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. It wasn't just a shift in attitude, Callahan had begun attending workshops on racial biases in law enforcement. It was a start, he told himself, but it felt so small in the grand scheme of things. He had learned enough to realize that simply attending a few classes wouldn't be enough to change a lifetime of ingrained habits. He had to dig deeper, confront harder truths, and most importantly, he had to be accountable, both to himself and to the community he served. One day, Callahan was called in for a meeting with his superior, Captain Robert Daniels. As soon as he walked into the captain's office, Callahan could feel the weight of the conversation already in the air. Captain Daniels, an older man with a stern face, motioned for him to sit. "Callahan," Daniels began, his voice low and measured. "There's been a lot of talk about what happened that night, about the stop with Senator Carter. Word travels fast, and let's just say it's become a topic of conversation. Callahan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't surprised. In the close-knit world of law enforcement, incidents like these didn't stay quiet for long. But the captain's tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. I've been hearing from a lot of people, some higher up the chain, that they're impressed with how you've been handling this, Daniels continued. You've been attending the diversity and bias training, showing initiative. But I'm gonna be honest with you, Callahan, actions speak louder than words. Callahan nodded, trying to suppress the nervous tension in his chest. I know, Captain. I'm trying. You've got potential, Daniels said, his gaze steady. But this is a job where you can't just talk about making changes. You've got to show it. Every day. Callahan felt the weight of the captain's words. They weren't just about him. They were about every officer who had ever made a similar mistake, and about the change he wanted to see in the system. He had a choice now, and this was where his real test began. Anything you need from me? Callahan asked, his voice a little stronger than it had been a few weeks ago. Daniels gave him a small nod. Keep pushing. Keep questioning yourself, Callahan. And don't stop learning. You're not alone in this. As Callahan left the office, he felt a surge of determination. The meeting had been exactly what he needed. It wasn't a pat on the back, it was a challenge, an expectation that he continue to evolve, not just for his career, but for the community he was sworn to protect. That evening, Callahan found himself reflecting on the night he had stopped Senator Carter. It had been an awakening, a turning point. He couldn't erase the mistakes of that moment, but he could use them as fuel to make things better. To make sure that others wouldn't have to face the same bias he had unconsciously perpetuated. The next few months passed quickly, and Callahan dove into his work with a new purpose. He became a staunch advocate for the department's new initiatives around community policing, aimed at breaking down the barriers of unconscious bias. They pushed for policy changes, advocating for new training and more accountability. And it wasn't just within the department. They began working with other law enforcement agencies, sharing their experiences and insights. It became clear that they weren't the only ones who had failed to see the deeper issues at play. But with each conversation, each new initiative, they saw small victories. They saw officers opening up, questioning their own assumptions, and realizing that the work they did every day had real consequences for the people they served. Then, one crisp fall morning, Callahan received an unexpected email. It was from Senator Rachel Carter, the woman whose words had changed the course of his life. She was coming to town for a public event, and she had requested a meeting with him. Callahan's stomach twisted. He hadn't spoken to her since that night, and now, months later, she wanted to talk. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He met her at a small coffee shop near the event venue. When he walked in, she was already seated at a corner table, her calm, composed demeanor unmistakable. Officer Callahan, she said, standing and extending her hand. Thank you for meeting with me. Thank you for taking the time, Callahan replied, shaking her hand firmly. They sat down, and for a moment, there was a silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with the weight of their shared history. You've been doing good work, Senator Carter said, breaking the silence. I've been hearing things about the changes you've been pushing for in the department. It's not easy, especially for someone in your position. Callahan nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. I'm trying. It's a long road, but I believe it's worth it. Carter leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. I know it is. But I also know that it's not just about policy changes. It's about people, about how we see each other, how we treat each other. You're on the right path, but don't let it stop with you. Push for more. Callahan's heart swelled with gratitude. She wasn't just congratulating him, she was reaffirming the importance of the work, the urgency of the change. This wasn't about one individual's journey, it was about systemic transformation. Thank you, Senator, Callahan said quietly. I won't stop. I promise. And as they parted ways, Callahan knew that he had a long road ahead. But it wasn't just his burden to carry anymore. It was a responsibility shared by every officer, every citizen, and every institution that had a part in shaping the world around them. The journey had begun with a single mistake. But it would continue with countless steps, each one a little bit closer to the change they all needed. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation within Callahan was undeniable. He found himself grappling with difficult conversations, often seeking out those who had been impacted by systemic injustice to understand their experiences better. He reached out to the community members who had felt the sting of bias, offering them an ear that hadn't been there before. The more he listened, the more he realized how much work lay ahead, not just for himself but for the entire force. His commitment to change wasn't just a quiet resolution anymore. It had become a fire that burned brightly within him. He pushed for reforms in how officers were trained, making sure that racial sensitivity and community engagement became central to every officer's development. And he wasn't doing this alone. Rhodes was right there beside him, sharing in the responsibility of dismantling the barriers that had kept the communities and the police at odds for so long. Then came a pivotal moment that marked the true test of his resolve. The city had been rocked by protests against police brutality, the tension between the police and the community reaching a boiling point. Callahan knew the stakes were high. These were not just protests, they were cries for justice, for change. And now, he was standing in the middle of it. He walked through the crowd, making his way toward the stage where the rally was being held. He was no longer just a police officer. He was someone who had become a bridge between two worlds that had long been divided. And as he approached the speaker's platform, there she was, Senator Rachel Carter. She spotted him in the crowd and motioned for him to join her. You've come a long way, Callahan, she said with a smile as he stood next to her. You're showing up. That's more than most. Callahan returned her smile but didn't speak. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze scanning the crowd. He knew there was so much more to be done, but he also realized something in that moment. Change wasn't just about policies, it was about presence. Showing up, standing in solidarity, and being willing to listen and learn. The rally began with Carter addressing the crowd, calling for justice, for accountability, and for systemic reform. And then, unexpectedly, she turned to Callahan. I want to introduce someone, she said, her voice clear and powerful. Someone who has taken the first steps toward truly understanding the issues we face. Officer Callahan has shown that change is possible. He's committed to the hard work it takes to make this system better. He's here, listening to you, because he believes you deserve to be heard. The crowd fell silent for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Callahan stood, feeling a surge of emotion in his chest. He had always kept his work behind the badge, but now, the weight of his responsibility was on full display. Taking a deep breath, Callahan stepped forward, facing the crowd. The city had been through so much, and he knew that his words, though simple, would not undo the years of distrust. But this was his moment to take ownership, to commit to being a part of the solution. I know I'm not perfect, Callahan began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. And I know the history of my profession, the history of policing, is filled with moments of pain and injustice. But I'm here today because I believe we can do better. I'm here because I believe we can build a system that serves everyone fairly. It won't be easy. It will take time. But I'm willing to put in the work, and I ask all of you to hold me accountable. The crowd's response was mixed, some hesitant, others hopeful. But as the cheers slowly began, Callahan realized that it didn't matter whether everyone was ready to forgive. What mattered was that he had taken the first step, and in doing so, he had opened the door for others to join him in this fight for change. Over the following months, Callahan continued his efforts to build stronger community ties. He spoke at schools, attended local meetings, and worked with grassroots organizations to implement real, lasting change in his department. He even became a mentor to younger officers, teaching them what he had learned, especially the importance of empathy, understanding, and accountability. His relationship with Senator Carter deepened as well. She continued to be a mentor, offering advice, guidance, and encouragement. The two of them, once strangers caught in an uncomfortable moment, had become partners in change, working together to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. And though there were still challenges ahead, moments of doubt, of resistance, of setbacks, Callahan knew that he was no longer the man he had been that night. He had been given a second chance, not just to be a better officer, but to be a better person. As he looked out at the city from his office one evening, the skyline illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, Callahan felt a sense of peace. There would always be more work to do, but he had learned that change didn't come in one grand gesture. It came in small, steady actions, each choice, each conversation, each step toward understanding. And in the end, that was all he could give, his commitment to doing better, to showing up, and to making the world just a little bit more just for everyone. The road ahead was long. But Callahan was no longer afraid to walk it. He was ready.